Well, let's begin. First of all, you had asked a question about rabbinic Judaism,
Right.
Diana. So let's begin there before we read. So the center of Jewish worship was the temple, the indisputed center of worship, and also much of the population of the Israelites was sort of concentrated around Jerusalem. So the the temple was, I wouldn't call it necessarily convenient, but accessible and the center of worship. So then we have a number of catastrophes. The temple was continually under attack, first by the Pharaoh in the 10th century BCE, then by the Assyrians. It was sacked in both cases, second time by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE. And then it was destroyed by Babylonians in 587. So the basic problem is that with no temple, what do you do? And so worship began to, or the synagogue began to gain in greater importance. And of course, Jews were sent into the diaspora. They were forced to migrate from the Holy Land to other places. And so they preserved their faith in some form by worshiping in the synagogue. So as opposed to the temple, which was really a place of sacrifice, where to the extent that there was prayer, to the extent that there was preaching, sermons, they were sort of incidental, not done by the priests, and incidental to the main operation of the temple, which really, I mean, in some sense, we can see the temple as simply a large slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
So it's a place of sacrifice. So then the temple was rebuilt after the Persian defeat of the Babylonians. It was rebuilt according to the book of Ezra. Work began in 538 BCE and was completed in 515 BCE, although those dates are unreliable. And so we have at that point a sort of for Jews in the diaspora, we have the beginning of the synagogue as sort of a major focus of worship, since Jerusalem is very, very far away from many. And increasingly, we have among Hellenized Jews, there's sort of a separation from Aramaic and Hebrew-speaking Jews in the Holy Land, since Hellenized Jews tend to have adopted much of the culture, Greek culture. We can see that, in fact, in the case of the author to a letter to the Hebrews. He appears to not speak Hebrew. He appears to largely be unfamiliar with the Hebrew scriptures. He, at least, if he is familiar with them, he hasn't used any yet. And it's not a yet. He doesn't use any in the course of his entire letter. And so whenever the Septuagint deviates from the Masoretic text, we can see his clear reliance only on the Septuagint. And so then in 70, the temple was definitively destroyed. And although there's a movement underfoot to rebuild the temple for the third time among some very conservative Jews who are also supported by some Christians, these being extremely right-wing movements. Currently the Dome of the Rock is on the Temple Mount, and so attempting to build a new temple there will be catastrophic. But for some, it's a requirement of Messianic Judaism, and for some Christians, it's a requirement of Christ's return, that Christ can't return until the temple is rebuilt and animal sacrifices are resumed.
That's still the belief now?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's the belief of premillennial dispensationalists, the rapture people.
The Jews or the Christians?
Christians.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Christians who believe in the rapture.
Oh, okay.
So no temple. And so since, regardless, one way or the other, I mean, if you focus your faith predominantly on the synagogue, nevertheless, you're supposed to go to Jerusalem for the major feasts, especially the Passover. And many people do, but also many people don't. But nevertheless, the temple remains the center of Jewish worship. And then suddenly it's gone. So that really poses or creates a major crisis. Like, what do we do now? What is the character of Judaism? If we look at the Torah, a significant portion of it is devoted to priestly function and to sacrifice. And now there's no temple. And sort of things go, there's the first Roman Jewish war, and then there's the second Roman Jewish war where the Jews were again defeated, and it became a capital offense for a Jew to be in Jerusalem. So being a Jew in Jerusalem could mean basically summary execution. So that makes it rather unlikely that the temple is going to be rebuilt anytime soon, especially that combined with the hegemony of the Roman Empire throughout the world. So that created a real crisis. And so the movement to the synagogue was a fairly, kind of automatic one. The question of what Judaism is in the first place is a much more difficult one, given the importance of sacrifice in the Jewish religious system. And so we have the beginning of an emphasis on Judaism as basically a moral and ethical system, which emerged in the synagogues. Then we also have the emergence of a variety of I guess you could call them semi-sacred or even sacred texts that supplement the Torah and the Masoretic text. So one of those is the Mishnah, which offers commentary on the Masoretic text. And the second is the Gemara, which has rabbinic analysis and commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah emerges around 200 CE or 200 AD. So we've every now and then I've commented on something contained in the Mishnah But the problem is that in some sense, the Mishnah is a compilation of rabbinic commentary that's anywhere from contemporary to Christ to 1.5+ centuries after Christ. So we can speculate in some cases that the contents of the Mishnah are contemporary to Christ, but we may be wrong. And then the Talmud combines the Mishnah and the Gemara. There are two versions of the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, which was published between 350 and 400 CE. And then the Babylonian Talmud, which is sort of the kind of standard version of the Talmud, or the version that's simply referred to as the Talmud, which is published about 500 CE, so nearly 500 years after the death of Christ. So we see the increasing importance of the, and so Rabbinic Judaism emerged, sort of as a full in more or less its full development only in 6th century. So it took a relatively long time, quite a long time after, for Judaism to make the transition from a system based on sacrifice to Yahweh to one based on ethics, morality, and an observation of the commandments of Yahweh and what Yahweh has called his people to do. The sort of exception to that, so Rabbinic Judaism really traces its major development from the destruction of the temple, but Orthodox Jews disagree with that. They instead focus on broader continuity from Moses and from the revelation of God to Moses at Mount Sinai, which explains the position of many Orthodox that there will be a third temple and the temple will be rebuilt. So in a nutshell, that's the kind of emergence of Rabbinic Judaism from after the destruction of the temple.
Okay.
It's really important to recognize what an earth-shattering event the destruction of the temple was in Jewish history, as well as in Christian history. Right? According to church tradition, there were no Christians in Jerusalem. Right. There were no followers of Christ in Jerusalem when the temple fell. They had all recognized the signs from the Olivet Discourse, and they had fled to Pella. So that itself is kind of a revealing commentary that the early Christians didn't do these crazy interpretations of the Olivet Discourse. They recognized that what Jesus was talking about, that he was talking about the destruction of the temple, and so they fled, which was the point of the first half of the Olivet Discourse, to get out when you see the signs, because the end of Jerusalem is near, and the end of an age is near, and the fall of the temple was the end of an age.
So they just think that Jesus was a prophet.
I wouldn't even necessarily go that far. It's in Islam that Jesus is a prophet. I don't think he has any recognized status in Judaism. Jesus is mentioned in the Quran as a prophet, but of course he's not the prophet.
Oh.
It was Muhammad.
Okay. Okay.
We'll talk a little bit about, sort of Judaism as we discuss Melchizedek,
Yeah.
probably, and that's sort of interesting.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm. So let's read again for the third time, and I think tonight we'll finish verses 1 through 6.
Okay.
Let's read verses 1 through 6. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is bound to offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for those of the people. And one does not take the honor upon himself, but he is called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So we have the Aaronic priesthood. And so the author of Hebrews is now arguing that Jesus is also a priest. And so on the surface of it, it doesn't appear that he can be a high priest because he's not a Levite, he's not descended from Aaron. The author points that out in chapter 7. We read that, I think, briefly last week. He's descended from David, so he's a Judean. The Messianic Jews of the period were expecting two people. They were expecting a priest and a king as separate persons for the most part, or in some cases, three people, a king, a priest, and a prophet. Or alternately, a king and two priests, a priest descended from Aaron, and a priest descended from Zadok. So those are, sort of the expectations. And then no other New Testament work explicitly speaks of Jesus as a high priest, although 2 weeks ago we discussed the implicit references to Jesus as high priest. And except for the Gospel of John, which was almost certainly written after 70, many of the works of the New Testament were probably contemporaneous with the Epistle to the Hebrews. So the author begins by using a citation from Psalm 2 to show that Christ was appointed. Let's take a look at Psalm 2. It should be familiar. We read it earlier. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? Kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "I have set my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with the rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling rejoice, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So the author draws on verse 7. I will tell of the decree of the Lord, and then he said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So if we go back to Hebrews chapter 1, that quotation was also used. It's in verse 5. For to what angel did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? So there it's used to show that Jesus is higher than the angels. And here it's used to argue that Jesus was appointed. So what was he appointed?
A priest.
That comes later.
Oh.
That comes in the next verse.
The
This
act-
is only about being son.
Yeah.
So the background here, the Psalm 110 and Psalm 2 are closely related, not only because of the fact that the author uses them
Hmm.
and likes to use them, and especially that Psalm 110 is very important to him, but also because they're both enthronement psalms. They're psalms that praise the king. So Psalm 2 is I think we discussed some of this when we discussed the use of Psalm 2 in chapter 1, but Psalm 2 is a coronation psalm. So the important thing about the Psalms is that, or many Psalms, some Psalms, is that within their context, they have a particular restricted meaning, I guess we could say. But they also point forward to have a deeper meaning in Christ. And so this is a coronation psalm. And in saying, you are my son, today I have begotten you, it doesn't mean that, God has a son in the literal sense that we would understand son as we understand Jesus to be the Son of God. It doesn't really mean that at all. It really refers to more of what we would think of as adoption, so that on the day of his coronation, because he was I had this same problem when we did this last time. Coronated is not a verb.
Yeah.
He was, what is the word? Made.
Appointed, made,
So
proclaimed.
proclaimed king, enthroned, maybe enthroned.
Yeah,
Okay, we'll use enthroned. So that means that on the day he was enthroned, the king was adopted by God and given unique protection.
Was that supposed to be for every king?
Yeah. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12. This kind of conveys the idea. So this is after all the complaining that we have no king, and Yahweh decides that a king can be appointed. And so it's actually 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. And now behold, the king whom you have chosen, or whom you have asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and listen to his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Well, we can stop there, but the point of the whole thing is that the king receives this kind of conditional anointing. The expectation is that the king will be righteous, holy, follow the commandments, and obey Yahweh. And for that, you will have divine protection, and Yahweh will pour out blessing. If not, then the reverse happens. And in addition to that, if we sort of look at the notion of kingship in the histories, in Chronicles, and in Kings, there's this frequent refrain that the king did whatever,
Mhm.
something bad, and the people sinned. And so the sort of implication of that is that the sins of the leader are followed, pursued by the people who therefore also sin. We can see that very clearly in our own time, that a bad leader's sins will be followed by his followers. So at his enthronement, the king, at coronation, that's what it is. At his coronation, the king receives blessing. What does this have to do? Does this have any relationship to priesthood? Or actually, what does this have to do with Christ? I mean, what is the author saying here?
Mm.
I mean, how this is the first step in the chain, and the next will be Psalm 110 and the priesthood of Melchizedek. But how are these related?
How are they relate? How is this passage related to Psalm 2, or how is this all related to Christ?
How do you build a concept of Christ as priest, starting with this? What are the assumptions of the author? What does he think that we should be understanding?
He'll be acting on behalf of men in relation to God, which eventually he does as part of his, his crucifixion. Deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, which he did throughout his life.
Mhm. Although here we only have, today you are my son.
So adopted, just
So-
like the other priests.
Well, no, not adopted.
He's a royal adoption, though.
Remember, within that if interpreted within a messianic context, that begotten is very significant. So remember, in the words of the creed, begotten, not made. If you're begotten, you're not, I mean, only Christ is begotten, but
Mhm.
begotten means not a creature. There are those created and those uncreated, or those begotten. what he's subtly saying here is that Christ is king and priest. So who is the king? Or how can Christ be described as king?
He's the son of the Father.
He is the son of the Father, and the Father is
It's
king.
king. Yeah.
There are numerous references to God as king, but let's look at Psalm 24 quickly. It's a relatively short psalm, so let's read the whole psalm, since I kind of liked it. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. The King of glory. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. So Yahweh is king, and therefore Yahweh's son is king. King isn't an appointed position. So he's just saying that Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed. So he's appointed king. And then he's appointed priest. In verse 6, as he says also in another place, you are priests forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So that's from Psalm 110, another coronation psalm. It was used, let's look at its use in earlier, again in chapter 1 of Hebrews, used in verse 13. He quotes the first verse of Psalm 110. But to what angel has he ever said, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a stool for your feet? And so here he uses verse 4 of Psalm 110 about the priesthood of Melchizedek. So let's look at Psalm 110. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your foes. Yours is dominion on the day you lead your host in holy splendor. From the womb of the morning I begot you. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. So once again, it's a coronation psalm, an enthronement psalm. It's thought to have been written around the time of David or Solomon, for the coronation of a Davidic king, or possibly to celebrate a king's military victory. And here again, it doesn't mean the king was physically begotten by God, but simply that the king, by virtue of being king, was adopted, anointed, and blessed. So interestingly, in some ways, we see the same political theology kind of at work today, that the leader is anointed. We see it especially in America, and especially among conservatives, when there's a conservative president, that he's anointed by God and God's choice. And so whatever he does is somehow anointed. But the problem is that there's a little detail of following God's commandments that typically is overlooked. So that anointing is not unconditional, except in the case of Christ, it is. So this is a coronation psalm, very clearly. And so then we have the problem of what happens when either there's no king, or the king is a vassal, or your state, so the northern kingdom, ceased to exist with the Assyrian invasion. So what happens when your state doesn't exist, there's no king? Or in the case of Judah, your king is a vassal or a puppet, or like Herod, not actually Jewish. So what do you do then?
If the king's not good, then the people tend to follow in that same way. And some other place it said that the wrath of God would be coming down upon the king and the people.
Uh-huh. And then what happens when there's no king? And what happens when people are scattered in the diaspora? Any idea?
Yeah, they'll follow that leader into sin, or they'll ask for another leader.
Well, remember, there's no leader. They're dispersed.
Oh, yeah. Oh, she turned to God.
You become messianic, Right.
Oh,
right? So, I mean, you know, the sort of think about a Seder. How does the Seder end? We've discussed the Seder. We were discussing the Eucharist. So the Seder begins, how is this night different than every other night, right? So that's called anamnesis. It's bringing a past event into the present and making it real. So tonight is the night of the Exodus. Tonight is the night that God sets his people free, just as he's done in the past. And then the Seder ends with, I'll see you next year
next year.
in Jerusalem. So, you know, there's a making a past event that God is the great liberator, present here and now, and then carrying it into the future, that God will draw his people together once again. So the point of that whole thing is that you begin to understand the psalm in a different way, so that from being a coronation psalm about the existing king, it becomes a prophetic psalm about the coming Messiah. And so kind of looking at that it's interesting. So I mentioned that there was an expectation that there would be, as separate people, a messianic king and a messianic priest, or
Hmm.
possibly two messianic priests, or possibly a messianic priest and prophet. And so here we have the author of Hebrews invoking both the Psalm 2 for the messianic king and Psalm 110 for the messianic priest in a single person, who is Christ. So the Psalm 110 is predominantly about a king, and it includes the line about Melchizedek. So some have argued that this was inserted and, long after the fact, and some kind of commentary or whatever, and perhaps doesn't really belong, but there doesn't seem really to be any really good evidence for that. So the messianic interpretation, the original messianic Jewish interpretation, it's a psalm about the king because the king is described as a priest, because kings, at least the early Davidic kings, David and Solomon, appear to have enjoyed the privileges of priesthood. So, for example, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 4, Solomon sacrifices at the altar of Gibeon, where God meets him. This is before the construction of the temple. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 18, it says, and David's sons were priests. So in some form, the king and his offspring evidently enjoyed the privileges of priesthood. There's also a view that this interpreted messianically, that the messianic priest or the messianic king would inaugurate a covenant that would last forever. So you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Doesn't necessarily mean a single person will live forever, but rather that the covenant that is inaugurated with his advent will live forever. So the Pharisees understood Psalm 110 in this way, as well as Psalm 2. So does anyone recall any evidence of that in the Gospels? Let's take a look at Mark chapter 12, verses 35 through 37. This also is found in Matthew, chapter 22 of Matthew, and in chapter 20 of Luke. It's most clearly, I selected Mark because it's most clearly a belief that's ascribed to the Pharisees explicitly here, whereas it's only implicit or not as explicit in Matthew and Luke. So as Jesus taught in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put your enemies under your feet.
Mm.
David himself calls him Lord. So how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly. So this was interpreted messianically as in Jesus' own time. Interestingly, later Jewish interpretation denied it was messianic. And so there's a Samaritan interpretation that Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah, and the later Jewish interpreters picked up that line of argument from Samaritans and argued that the priesthood, as established inherently by Yahweh, had to be based on primogeniture.
On
So
what?
primogeniture, so it would pass through from male to the firstborn male. And so we'll look at Melchizedek in Genesis in a minute, but the argument was that Melchizedek failed in his priestly function, failed abysmally in his priestly function, because he offered a sacrifice to Abraham before he offered it to Yahweh, which is, kind of might be seen as a no-no. And therefore, the priestly line passed from Abraham to Aaron. And then there were sort of other non-messianic interpretations, that it was purely a reference to David's enthronement, that it merely reflects the concept of divine kingship in the Hebrew scriptures, etc. Let's look at Melchizedek. It's in Genesis chapter 14, verses 17 through 20. So Abraham and a group of other people, leaders, including the king of Sodom, have defeated the five kings and are returning. And so in verse 17 it says, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, blessed be God, Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So you see, Abram blessed first, and God Most High blessed afterwards, according to the non-messianic Jewish interpretation.
So you're saying that Abram gave Melchizedek, some of the take of the wealth they earned. Is there a certain amount that they gave him?
And that corresponds to a tithe.
That's what I was wondering, if it was 10% or.
Yeah. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything.
Oh, there it is. I
Yeah.
couldn't find it. 10th of everything.
So the author uses Psalm 110, which speaks of one who is a king first and then a priest. We see in two quotations, Psalm 2 and 110, united here by the notion of Christ as king and priest. What about Melchizedek? Melchizedek is described as king of Salem. There's considerable debate about the historicity of Melchizedek, whether he actually existed or not.
Mm,
What is the case, certainly, is that this was, in fact, the period in which monotheism was emerging in the Middle East. Melchizedek would have been a Canaanite priest, and monotheism was emerging among the Canaanites. Abraham, who was a monotheist, there were almost certainly monotheistic priests. And so any monotheistic person, sort of by default, the God of a monotheist will be Yahweh. Melchizedek is king of Salem. Salem becomes Jerusalem. Uru is I think a Canaanite root word that means city.
it means what?
City,
Oh, a city, okay.
Uru. So Jerusalem becomes the Semitic equivalent.
Oh, I see.
And so Jerusalem means city of peace. So it's not Jerusalem yet. It's only Salem.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Why is he dragging in Melchizedek here? What is the significance of Melchizedek?
He's not a Levite. In fact, he's not Jewish.
No, he's a Gentile,
Yeah.
but he's a high priest forever or something, a priest forever.
According to the order of Melchizedek, actually, order of Melchizedek is order is probably not the best word to describe it, since order means a complete line.
Right.
And there isn't an order here. There's the author's opinion. There's only Melchizedek and Christ. In chapter 7, he uses the word likeness instead of order.
Mhm.
The likeness or similarity to is probably a better word than order. Order would apply to the Aaronic priesthood, since one succeeds another, succeeds another, succeeds another, and so on. But so a succession of two isn't an order. So, but what else? Why Melchizedek? So he points forward to the inclusion of the Gentiles and to Yahweh becoming the God of the nations. So that is true. That he, as Healy points out, that he's a Gentile suggests a universal priesthood not limited to the Israelites. What else?
Well, he's both a king and a priest.
Mm-hmm.
And his priesthood is superior to the Levites, the Levitical priests,
Right.
higher than.
And so, yeah, the Levitical priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood is established later after the Exodus. So he's a priest before the establishment of the priesthood of Aaron. Actually, it's time to stop. I thought we would finish Melchizedek tonight, but we barely started.
Oops.
So the question here, has anyone just, we won't discuss it, but I'll pose the question. Has anyone detected any Eucharistic references here?
Well, the bread and wine, oh.
Yeah, we'll discuss that next week. I want to read, there's a lot of patristic commentary that
Mhm.
we can look at for Melchizedek, but I want to read Saint Cyprian of Carthage. And also examine a comment from Saint Clement of Alexandria. And also examine Saint Robert Bellarmine's analysis of Melchizedek. Bellarmine was a contemporary of Saint Thomas Aquinas and one of the leaders of the scholastic movement along with Aquinas. And is generally really good. So next week we'll continue with Melchizedek, and we'll also do verse 7, and possibly we'll do the exhortation, but if we get to it, but maybe not. One never knows.
Ah,
We are moving pretty rapidly, though, with blazing speed.
Yeah,